Just 1 second, please. But here for the Canales project, there is no note that it's estimated. It simply states, quote, 25% recovery rate, close quote.
You know, that's true. The previous column they have run 1,000 gallons through the RO system and returned 250 gallons. So that is a 25% recovery rate.
And actually, I was going to turn to column T next. That tells us that they were able to recover 250 gallons after processing 1,000 gallons, right?
Correct.
In column S, treatment description, it says, quote, entire treatment train RO main treatment of Entrada PW for produced water at 10,000 TDS, treated to 500 TDS, comma, used on tree seedlings, close quote. Did I read that right?
Correct.
And it says treated to 500 TDS, past tense, correct?
True.
And it says used on tree seedlings, also in the past tense, right?
True.
Did the trees grow?
I don't know.
And looking at column K for the Canales project, NMED authorized this project 13 months ago, correct?
I'm sorry, this whole line of questioning is about a project that has not occurred yet. And so any inferences in those columns should not be made. This project is still in the design phase. Even it has not constructed. They have not placed water on any seedlings. We've been in contact with the person who is doing this project, and we are still working through design
Mr. Herman,
aspects of it.
I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
I'm trying to test that information because the information that we have in this spreadsheet, which NMED has put together, indicates past tense use of words and says that the project has been completed. Correct?
Okay, so we may be able to then wrap up this line of questioning with one question, which is, regardless of the use of past tense, this project hasn't begun yet. The past tense is not appropriate here. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay, so I don't think we have to go through every cell to demonstrate the past tense should not have been used here.
So I guess my question then is, if this project has not begun, looking back to column Y, why does it say that the lab analysis has been completed?
My best guess, which is the greatest thing to do in testimony, is that it was a transcription error into the spreadsheet or a data entry error, which does occur.
Now, just so I'm clear, Ms. Murphy, are you the individual who maintains this spreadsheet?
I am.
Did you make an error when you entered this data?
I believe that this is the lab analysis from the treated produced water, and it is run through the consortium's guidelines of the NPDES Plus list, the wet testing, and the NTA.
And that analysis has been completed?
And that the lab analysis has been completed.
Okay.
we don't have this lab analysis.
Yes, I understand that. Who oversees this project?
Can you clarify oversee?
Who's responsible for overseeing the data collection and turning the data over to the department?
It would be the entity that submitted the notice of intent
Okay,
and the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium.
okay. Has NMED entertained the possibility that the data is bad for produced water and it's not being shared with NMED because it would be harmful to the future use of produced water?
I have no reason to assume any of that.
I'm not going to go through all of these projects with you,
Thank you.
but there are a couple other red flags that I have to ask you about. Looking at project number 5, Tascosa Energy Partners Hydrosonics,
Mhm.
NMED approved this project a year ago in May of 2023.
May I clarify that NMED does not approve projects.
The NMED,
We make a determination as to whether or not they would be discharging and within our authority.
and that then
Within our authority,
is what allows them to proceed with the project, correct?
pending they have all their other permits and determinations from other agencies, yes.
And the goal in that project was to take 3 samples and run risk and toxicology analyses and provide them to NMED, correct?
We'll let Ms. Murphy expand on that.
Sure.
Yes, it was an enhanced evaporation project.
Have you received the results and data set for even one of those samples?
So that project is under the jurisdiction of the OCD. And when that project went over there, they found out they needed to get a more complicated permit.
So you have not received any results or data set for even one of the samples?
No.
Now, there's been some discussion about the entities that are running these pilot projects. And I want to ask a couple of questions about the entities. Would that be best directed towards Ms. Murphy?
I think once we hear your questions and understand the content and the
Okay.
context, we can figure out who to direct that to.
Generally, the pilot projects are being run by LLCs and corporations, correct?
It looks to be that way, yeah.
And if something were to go wrong with the pilot projects, those LLCs and corporations would be liable for any damages caused.
I will hand that to Mr. Herman to answer.
Great, thank you.
It won't be exciting. I would much rather not speculate as to liability or a legal determination of who would be responsible for cleanup. It's not our area of expertise.
Generally, if there is a discharge that's unauthorized, the entity that discharged the effluent is responsible for the cleanup, correct?
That seems like a very simple question on the outset. I'll say generally that yes, that would be true.
Great. And then I pose this question to any of the members of the panel. Is NMED aware that any entity that conducts business in New Mexico is required to register with the Secretary of State and have a registered agent for the purpose of service of legal process?
Okay, this is objection. This is well beyond the scope of anyone's testimony.
Mr. Dodd?
Madam Hearing Examiner, part of this regulation discusses financial assurances for liability of cleanup and those sorts of things. And that's what I'm testing here because we've already had some of this activity going on. And I want to test to the extent to which NMED has already been making sure that these entities could be held liable here in the courts of New Mexico.
All right, so there's obviously one potential problem with that, which is that they can't give legal testimony, and they may or may not be able to answer the question at all. So, Ms. Fulham, why don't you either say whether the division can answer questions about financial assurance or not?
I don't believe any of the witnesses here have the ability to answer questions regarding financial assurance.
Okay, thank
Okay.
you.
But are you aware that 6 of the entities that have already conducted or proposed to conduct pilot projects here in New Mexico are not registered with the New Mexico Secretary of State?
I would not know.
Okay. And so NMED is not aware that Canales LLC, Solmem LLC, Zwitter Co., Z Nano Membranes, GC Solutions, and Sun Vapor are not businesses registered with the Secretary of State.
I do not look up these companies on the Secretary of State's website. I don't know. I don't look up businesses in general. I look for water quality.
Thank you, Ms. Fallman. I'd like to move more towards Mr. Herman now. Mr. Herman, first I want to talk to you about NMED's interactions with the consortium. Okay?
Yes.
In December of 2022, there was an external review audit of the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium, which addressed the organizational structure and leadership of the consortium, correct?
Yes.
The review team interviewed many stakeholders to evaluate whether the consortium was meeting its goals.
That was the instructions. I believe in the MOU attachment.
And you yourself were one of the individuals interviewed as an NMED stakeholder as part of the external review audit.
Correct.
And the external review audit was conducted by Jim Chavez, Senior of NMSU, Dr. Carrie Howe of Howe Water Science, and Dr. Duncan McBranch of Los Alamos National Labs, correct?
To the best of my recollection, those were the 3 people that interviewed me, yes.
Would it help refresh your recollection if you looked at their report?
I will agree to it, but I'd love a copy of it.
Great.
Yeah, can you provide an exhibit number for that?
Yes, and that's going to be exhibit NG14, which was filed with Norm Gown's rebuttal testimony, which is NEE Exhibit 4. And this particular report is contained at pages 80 to 94 of exhibit number 4. And actually, I have the hard copy for you, but I also have hard copies for members of the commission. And if we have enough for any party that may want one, these were uploaded to Dropbox, however. It's attached to his rebuttal testimony. It's NEE Exhibit 4. Mr. Herman, could you please turn to page 2? And I don't believe they're paginated, so you may just have to count the pages as we refer to them. I apologize for that.
I can get up to 2.
All right. Looking at the first bullet on page 2, could you please read that for us?
Sure. Stakeholders have differing expectations of the consortium and opinions of its progress to date. Industry seems to be generally satisfied with consortium, dialogue, and research. NMED is not. I'm sorry, that was unclear. NMED is not. The research resulting from the RFP has focused on technology development and thus far has not generated the data that is necessary for developing regulations.
And now, can we go to the fourth bullet on page 2? Could you please read that for us?
Sure. The organizational structure is not clearly defined, which leads to issues in reporting, accountability, and operations. This contributes to mismatches in expectations on research outcomes.
And the audit team concluded their letter portion of the audit by setting forth a summary on the 3rd page. Could you please read for us the second paragraph on page 3?
Sure. In summary, the New Mexico State Legislature directed the NMED to develop regulations for the use of produced water outside the oil and gas industry, and the consortium is an essential contributor to that rulemaking process. It is unlikely that the consortium can accomplish its stated mission of generating the data needed to support the development of regulations if it has inadequate funding, an unclear organization structure, and lack of clarity in expectations in research and outcomes. The recommendations of the committee or some similar actions are needed if the consortium is to continue.
Thank you. And now, also attached to the letter was a PowerPoint exhibit. Could you turn to the 8th page of the packet?
Just to verify, is that key stakeholders were interviewed?
It is observations, titled observation.
I'm concerned about my ability to count now.
No worries. So you're on that page?
Observations.
In the 3rd major bullet, the independent external review team observed that there's a difference in expectations from stakeholder groups and opinions about its progress to date, correct?
Yes.
And the review team further found, quote, some don't appreciate the difficulty that NMED will have regulating this. PW, as in produced water, is a contentious issue. The public will complain no matter what NMED does. So they, NMED, have to have airtight science with chain of custody, peer review, no conflicts of interest, etc., to back up the regulatory process, close quote. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And the way that the review team obtained this information was through interviews conducted of NMED employees, correct?
Amongst other stakeholders.
Other people that they interviewed as well.
Yes.
But they would be getting information about NMED's concerns from NMED, correct?
I have no way of speculating on what anyone else said in those interviews.
Okay. Turning to page 10. And it's titled Observations Continued. I know it's complicated. The double-sided pages do not help. And the first words at the first bullet are the organizational structure. Are you there? I tried to make it as complicated as possible for you.
I like puzzles.
It's a cross-examination tactic. All right. So on page 10, actually, let me tell you which bullet to go to. Give me just 1 second. The fifth bullet, fifth minor bullet under the first major. The review team expressed concerns about issues of oversight, questioning, quote, who provides oversight to the industry-funded research to ensure that protocols are followed and the results are defensible? Is the research director supposed to do this? Is there a panel or advisory committee? Close quote. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. To date, can NMED tell the commission who provides oversight for this research?
With any level of certainty, I don't want to say impression. My understanding is that Mike Hightower, as the director of the consortium, oversees the projects and the research.
Okay. Mr. Herman, I'd like to now shift over. You can put that exhibit away.
Thank you.
Oh, actually, just 1 second. Yeah, actually, can we go back? If you could just read the first major bullet for us on that same page.
Starts the organizational.
Yes.
The organizational structure is not clear, which leads to issues in reporting, accountability, and operations. This could be, and this is a parenthetical, this could be the source of issues on expectations and research validation.
And now turning to page 12. If you could read the first major bullet and the first minor bullet for us, please.
Just to verify, this is recommendations continued.
Correct.
I'm sorry, which bullets did you want me to?
The first major bullet and the first minor bullet.
Strengthen and clarify documentation and communication. Provide guidelines for research, documentation, and validation, parenthetical, RFP, research contracts, and parenthetical. What research was research completed and documented? How should it be communicated to NMED so it can be used in rulemaking?
Thank you, Mr. Herman. Are you aware of any organizational changes at the consortium in response to this report?
No.
Thank you. All right. Now I'd like to, we can put that one away. Thank you. I'd like to talk about NMED's understanding and interpretation of the Produced Water Act and the associated amendments to the Water Quality Act, okay? I believe that you are the right person on the panel to address this topic. Is that right?
I'll do my best.
Thank you. I'd like to look at the department's interpretation of the duties and jurisdiction of NMED and the commission, okay?
Is there an exhibit number? Or just in general?
I don't have the exhibit number here. I'm going to be referring to section 74-6-4P. And I apologize, I don't have the exhibit number.
74-6-4 subsection P.
Correct. And just let me know when you're ready. And I believe it's NMED Exhibit 16.
Got it.
Section P states that the Commission, quote, shall adopt regulations to be administered by the Department of the Environment for the discharge, handling, transport, storage, recycling, or treatment for the disposition of treated produced water, including disposition in road construction maintenance, roadway ice or dust control, or other construction, or in the application of treated produced water, or activities unrelated to the exploration, drilling, production, treatment, or refinement of oil and gas. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Now, this subsection is a subsection of the Water Quality Act, correct?
Yes.
And I just want to clarify because there's been some question about the inclusion of the phrase, quote, for the disposition of treated produced water, close quote. Now, that does not mean that NMED and the Commission only get to regulate the end uses of produced water, right?
Objection that calls for a legal conclusion.
Yeah, to the extent you're asking them for a legal conclusion, I'll ask you to move on.
I'll rephrase the question. In drafting the proposed rule, was it NMED's interpretation of that language, quote, for the disposition of treated produced water, close quote, that the department only gets to regulate the end uses of produced water?
Well, I will start my response by saying that this rule is not intended to be a produced water rule. It's intended to be a reuse rule. And that is first and foremost that we were looking at drafting the rule for reuse through the Water Quality Act. I would say that I do not recall any discussions during the drafting process that directly answers your question. And so I think the answer is I don't know.
Okay. Now, NMED's interpretation of the use of produced water is that the use of produced water is considered, quote, disposition by use, close quote. Is that correct?
I'm going to ask if you could rephrase that. I'm not sure I understand your question.
Let me direct you to another subsection, okay?
Mhm.
Section 70-13-4C. And I'll see if I can get you the
Exhibit 19.
I believe it is 19. That's correct. And it's subsection 4C. NMED Exhibit 19, Section 70-13-4C. All right. Do you see that section?
Yes, sir.
Included within the language is, quote, the disposition of produced water, recycled water, or treated water, including disposition by use, is neither an appropriation of water for beneficial use under Chapter 72 NMSA 1978, nor a waste of water, and no water right shall be established by the disposition of produced water, recycled water, or treated water. Is it NMED's, sorry, did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Is it NMED's understanding of this statute that the use of produced water is a disposition of produced water?
Can I answer this?
Yes.
The section that you're reading is specific to the Office of the State Engineer, not to the Water Quality Control Commission. And the use of language and terms under the state engineer are different than those under the Water Quality Act. So the terms that are being used in this section are not applicable under the WQCC.
Okay. So Ms. Fulham, you testified on direct, and this is going to be, give me 1 second. I'll find a site for your testimony. Give me just a moment. This is going to be your direct testimony, NMED Exhibit 2, at pages 17 to 18, beginning at line 22.
Okay.
You testified on direct that, quote, in 2019, shortly after the adoption of the Produced Water Act, NMED, EMNRD, and the OSC held several joint public presentations on produced water management, close quote. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you referred to NMED Exhibit 61.
That's correct.
And that's the PowerPoint presentation that was presented at those meetings, correct?
I believe so, yes.
All right,
Yes,
now,
it is.
okay. I'd like to take a look at page 31 of NMED Exhibit 61, which is also Bates number 001814.
What page of that presentation? Sorry.
Page 31.
What is the role of the state engineer in
Yes.
produced water management? Okay,
And this was in a joint presentation of all three entities, correct?
correct.
And it was stated at that presentation, quote, the use of produced water is considered disposition by use, correct?
As it pertains to the Office of the State Engineer.
Does it say that in the section that I read?
It says, what is the role of the Office of the State Engineer in produced water management? So yes,
And you would agree that the Produced Water Act was a comprehensive regulation or comprehensive piece of legislation
I couldn't speak to that.
to oversee produced water in New Mexico, correct?
I couldn't state whether it's comprehensive or not.
You would agree that the section to which I was referring earlier, section 70-13-4C, is contained within the Produced Water Act, correct?
Correct, that's within the Produced Water Act.
And so I want to go back to Mr. Herman. Mr. Herman, is it NMED's understanding that NMED has complete authority and jurisdiction to regulate all discharge, handling, transport, storage, recycling, or treatment of produced water for activities unrelated to the exploration, drilling, production, treatment, or refinement of oil and gas?
Objection calls for a legal conclusion. I mean, if we're going to be interpreting statutes, we need attorneys to do that. These are technical witnesses.
Right. So, Mr. Dodd, I mean, you're going to have a chance to make legal arguments as part of your closing submittal.
Could I respond briefly, please?
Yes.
I just want to say, I'm asking what NMED's understanding of their statutory role is when crafting these regulations. And so I think that that's relevant to these proceedings because what they understand their power to be then influences the regulations that they then promulgate and that they've proposed to this commission.
Okay, so, but then what is your ultimate question? That is to say, um, would it be better, I'm trying to be helpful, to turn it around and ask what they would consider outside their scope? Is there something in particular that you want them to confirm?
Yes,
Aside-
I want to ask about what they can do with regards to produced water. So I can jump just to that.
Okay,
So first of all, NMED's understanding of this regulation, of this statutory scheme, says that does not say, sorry, that you have to allow the discharge of produced water, correct?
I do not, my understanding of the Produced Water Act is that it does not mandate NMED to issue discharge permits for produced water.
And in fact, that's why NMED has been able to bring forward a regulation or a proposed rule that prohibits the discharge of produced water, right?
I think in part, yes.
And similarly, this is what I want to understand. Does NMED take the position when it was crafting this proposed rule? Was it NMED's understanding that it can propose regulations that would prohibit the handling of produced water off of the oil field?
Can you repeat the question, please?
When this regulation was being promulgated, was it NMED's understanding that it could prohibit the handling of produced water off of the oil field?
Again, I think that NMED, us as technical staff, would rely on our Office of General Counsel to provide us direction as to where that authority lies. I don't believe that that is part of our proposed rule.
Yeah, I think that the rule that we proposed is within the authority of the department and the Produced Water Act and the Water Quality.
Okay. Would you have proposed a rule that prohibited the handling of produced water outside the oil field?
Okay,
Objection
that-
asked and answered.
right. I'm sustaining the objection. You continue to try to draw them out on what they speculate as to what their authority might be. And that's not for them.
The reason that NMED has decided to prohibit discharges of produced water is because there is insufficient data and evidence that discharges would be safe for the environment and public health and safety, correct?
They've given that testimony at least 3 times that I remember, twice during this cross an hour ago. They've already, you opened with that testimony. You've already had them confirm that. Do you have other topics?
I do. When NMED was promulgating this rule, this proposed rule, it was under the understanding that the Water Quality Act requires credible scientific evidence when promulgating regulations, correct?
Incorrect.
Could you please explain?
Yes, I can. First, NMED does not promulgate regulations. We petition for proposed regulations for the commission to adopt and then promulgate. Second, regulations do not require scientific evidence to be adopted. In the Water Quality Act, it specifically states that standards require defensible scientific evidence. Regulations are not standards.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
You're welcome.
One of the things that NMED looked at when coming up with this proposed rule was the character and degree of injury to or interference with health, welfare, environment, and property, correct?
Correct.
Now, did NMED consider the best available scientific information?
I believe so.
Would you agree that any handling, transportation, storage, recycling, and treatment of produced water off of the oil fields involves a degree of risk of releases and spills?
I can only speak to the protection of groundwater quality.
And wouldn't releases and spills potentially damage groundwater quality?
I believe our proposed regulations refer back to 20.6.2.1201, which is for the release of contaminants that are reportable to the department.
And so does NMED agree that the handling, transportation, storage, recycling, and treatment of produced water off of the oil fields involves some degree of risk of
Yep.
contamination of groundwater?
If there was a spill, it would be required to be reported under our current regulations, with or without these regulations.
I understand that it would be required to be reported, but the question that I'm asking is, would handling of produced water off of the oil fields involve a degree of risk of releases and spills that could impact groundwater quality?
Has anyone on this panel testified about the handling of produced
No.
water on the oil fields?
No,
Or you're not even qualified to give that testimony?
no. That's what I'm
This
struggling with.
is, this is not the panel to ask that of.
Madam Hearing Examiner, I'm asking if NMED has looked at the risks of handling produced water off of the oil fields, not on the oil fields. Maybe I misspoke.
Okay, so you didn't ask it that way, whether that was part of what they looked at on the way to drafting the regulation. You just asked them to confirm that it was a true statement.
Okay.
So you can ask that part.
Did NMED consider the risk that releases and spills from the handling of produced water off of the oil fields might pose to groundwater?
To the extent necessary for drafting the rule as we did with the prohibition. Sorry, to the extent, lost my train of thought. Sorry. To the extent necessary for drafting the rule as we did, yes.
And so NMED was aware that in 2020, there were 714 spills of produced water on the oil fields, right?
I do not recall testifying to that or any of my panel members testifying to that.
So I direct you to NMED Exhibit 37 at page 10.
We are on page 10.
Do you see table 2-4?
Were you talking about the BLM water support document for oil and gas
Correct.
on page 10?
Page 10. Table 2-4.
We have that page.
Okay. In that table, there is a row that says produced water, correct?
Yes.
And just to clarify, this table is a summary of 2020 spills in the state of New Mexico within the oil and gas industry, right?
Yes.
And in the produced water spill count column, it states that there were 714 spills of produced water on the oil fields in 2020, correct?
Yes.
And those 714 spills involved 65,176 barrels of produced water.
Yes.
And there are 42 gallons in a barrel, correct?
Yes.
You don't have to do the math, but will you trust me that that's over 2.7 million gallons of spilled produced water?
I trust you.
Thank you. Did NMED consider what would happen if 2.7 million gallons of produced water were spilled outside of the oil fields in New Mexico?
This table was not used in the development or drafting of the regulations.
And so NMED did not consider what would happen if 2.7 million gallons of produced water were spilled throughout the state of New Mexico off of the oil fields. Is that right?
We considered spills as a potential, but not that specific number from this specific source.
What would happen if 2.7 million gallons of produced water were spilled into the Rio Grande River?
Beyond the scope.
Yeah, Mr. Dodd. Beyond the scope of their testimony.
And I just would like to briefly respond, please. Madam Hearing Officer, I'm trying to test the degree to which NMED evaluated risk posed to off oil field or risk posed by off oil field use and transportation of produced water. And I think that this question goes to that. And this panel is here to testify on behalf of NMED in support of a rule that would permit the transportation of produced water throughout the state off of the oil field.
All right. I still don't think that the question as to what would happen with, I think you said 2.7 million gallons of water into the Rio Grande is something that they came here prepared to discuss.
Okay. Mr. Herman, I just have one other question, okay? NMED would agree that decision makers who have the responsibility for protecting people in the environment need to weigh potential benefits and risks posed by produced water use, correct?
And I will speak for myself as an employee of NMED. Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to move to my questioning of Ms. Lucas Kamal. Is that right? Ms. Lucas Kamal, I'd like to talk with you about this notice of intent process for produced water demonstration projects. Would that be okay?
I did not testify to the notice of intent process for produced water. It's not part of 401 certification.
Okay. Who would I better direct these questions to? Ms. Fulham or Ms. Murphy?
I can try and answer if you can repeat the question.
Okay. I want to talk about the notice of intent process for produced water demonstration projects and
Okay.
industrial projects. And that's under subsection 400 of the proposed rule, correct?
Correct.
So an applicant, and the words are weird, okay? Let me just say the person proposing a project needs to obtain a determination of no permit, no discharge permit needed before they can use produced water, correct?
I will be okay with your description. Yes,
Okay, you agree with that?
sure.
And the person who's proposing a project obtains such a determination by submitting a produced water NOI.
Correct.
And in the NOI, the person proposing the project must provide the information that's set forth in subsections or subsection C1A, correct?
We've talked about so many things today.
I know. I apologize.
C1A, yes.
Okay. I want to ask, what is the applicable definition of discharge for this rule? I couldn't find a definition for that term anywhere in the statutes or regulations, and I thought that you might know.
There is no definition for discharge, and Mr. Herman is the best to speak to that.
Mr. Herman, what is the definition of discharge, if any, for this portion?
Sure. There is no definition for discharge in the Water Quality Act, Produced Water Act, 20.6.2 or 20.6.4. It is a term that has evolved over the decades of implementation of these regulations. And if you, it oftentimes confuses people that activities that would traditionally not be considered a discharge, we would define as a permitting program a discharge. We would define it as a discharge.
Could you give me a couple of examples of some things that pose, that cause some confusion?
Sure. In the instances of double-lined synthetic impoundments with leak detection systems, we consider that a discharge. It reverses the idea in most people's minds that a discharge is some sort of activity that would move, but we work off of potential for discharge in order to ensure that we're being protective. So in that example, double-lined synthetic impoundment with leak detection has the potential still to affect groundwater, and therefore we would require a discharge permit for. Another example would be a very high level radioactive liquid waste treatment system that was fully contained, has zero discharge, and only transports any type of effluent to the waste isolation pilot project, is still considered a potential for discharge to ground or surface water, and therefore would require a discharge permit.
So let me see if I can clarify a little bit for my own edification. If there is any potential for discharge, then it's considered a discharge?
I would agree with your statement, except for the word any.
Please
you know,
clarify.
It's a, I don't want to use the word judgment, but it is a determination that the department makes that the potential is to the extent that would require a discharge permit with monitoring conditions. So oftentimes a discharge permit is required when, with the easy ones, the double synthetic liner with leak detection, that there's a potential for failure of that liner. And we have evidence that a liner or a double liner or the leak detection has failed in instances. And we have therefore decided that potential there was enough to require a discharge permit.
Okay. I'm not sure that totally clarifies it for me, but it sounds like it isn't really a clear thing. It depends on the situation and the circumstances.
It does. It depends not just on the technology, the equipment, the methods, but it also depends upon the site. So a site that has more than 1,000 or 1,300 feet to groundwater is treated differently than one that is 50 feet to groundwater or 5 feet to groundwater. There's a multitude of factors that that would go into a determination as to whether or not there was a potential.
Can I add clarification though?
Please, Ms. Fuller.
When we're talking about lagoons and impoundments, they have the potential, lagoons and impoundments, they have the potential to discharge and would be required to have a discharge permit. So they would not be one of those. There's no ifs, ands, or buts on lagoons and impoundments. The conditions that are in the discharge permit and the potential risk to groundwater decreases depending or increases depending on depth to groundwater and site-specific conditions. I just want to make it clear that those determinations, a line lagoon, clay line lagoon, double synthetic liner with leak detection, they all require discharge permits, to make that clear for you.
Okay. What about a tanker truck traveling down a highway? Would that require a discharge permit?
As far as I know, the Water Quality Act and the Water Quality Control Commission does not develop the regulations for the Department of Transportation. But again, this is again going into an area in which our staff and part of this regulation do not address, and so we're not prepared to testify to.
Well, let me clarify a little bit then.
And we'll need a break soon, Mr. Dodd.
Okay. This rule proposes to allow research of unproduced water outside of the oil fields, correct?
Correct.
The water has to get to the research facility in some manner, correct?
Correct.
And so whether there's going to be a discharge or not is determined in part by the manner in which it is transported, correct?
I would disagree with that. There is another half to this regulatory authority, and that involves OCD. There is transportation of produced water every single day under OCD. I don't believe that this rule even crosses that boundary.
Even if
So-
even if the produced water is being transported off of the oil fields out of the jurisdiction of OCD, are you saying that NMED is not going to regulate that activity?
We have regulations, which I think I've already testified to under 20.6.2 regarding incidental releases and discharges without a permit, which that if there were to be an accident, spill, or incident involving a trucker and it were to release something, we have surface water and groundwater who respond to all spills of contaminants, whether that be produced water or other contaminants. And it gets divvied out. I think it's beyond the scope of this testimony, but it gets divvied out between the different bureaus within NMED, Department of Transportation, State Police, and Incident Command. Can go on, but there are provisions already in place for any spill or release, whether it to be groundwater or surface water. So I'm uncertain if that's not sufficient for your understanding, or if you need more detail on that.
Well, doesn't the NOI require that the NOI proponent give you information about the transport and handling of produced water?
A plan, so in section C1(8), it requires a plan to transport in and transport out of any untreated produced water or treated produced water in a safe manner in accordance with state and federal regulations.
And so NMED would look at the transport plan. And if it looks like it will result in a discharge, What is the NMED going to do?
I'm visualizing because I'm struggling with where where you're trying to lead us to say. I mean, if they say that they're going to put it in a semi truck with the back end open, yeah, we would most definitely say that that would be a discharge. And if they're preemptively telling us they're going to let it leak out the back of the truck, there's going to be a prohibition of that. That's part of this is that they cannot get a discharge permit, they cannot discharge. And telling us they're letting it leak out the back of the truck would be admission of a discharge. If it were to be incidental or accidental, it would fall under 20.6.2. And they would have the reporting requirements, just like every other contaminant that's accidentally released. Are we getting to,
I think we ought to take a break now.
okay, I would agree.
Yeah, it's been more than 90 minutes. Let's take 10 minutes. Just All right, we have less than an hour left together. So, Ms. Nanasi, I see you in the examiner's seat over there.
Yes, thank you. For the record, my name is Marielle Nanasi with New Energy Economy, and I will be questioning Dr. Hu.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Hu.
Good afternoon.
You have reviewed and are familiar with current peer-reviewed scientific studies with regard to practices and challenges, including risks for produced water treatment and reuse, correct?
Yes, I reviewed a lot of paper regarding the produced water treatment toxicity assessment.
You co-authored the characterization of produced water in the Permian Basin for potential beneficial use.
Can you
That-
repeat? Sorry.
And that was in 2022, appeared in the New Mexico Water Resources Research Institute Technical Completion Report number 398, correct?
Yes, correct.
Even though you co-authored that scientific report, it is not included in NMED's filing, correct?
Yes,
But New Energy Economy did include your report that you helped co-author as in New Energy Economy Exhibit 4, the rebuttal technical testimony of Norman Baum as Exhibit NG18, correct?
I'm sorry. I'm not seeing that exhibit. Was it put in the Dropbox as a demonstrative exhibit? It was filed.
If I may answer,
Please.
it is in the Dropbox. It's in the Dropbox as New Energy Economy Exhibit 4. I do have a copy. And then there's exhibits with Mr. Gaum's rebuttal. And this is NG18. And I do have a copy if I can approach.
Yeah, I think that would help.
Ms. Jones, might you be able to pull that up on the screen? Well, I sent it to you, and my title on it is called February 2022 Characterization of. Okay. You have that before you, correct?
yes, yes,
And you were a co-author of that report, correct?
yes.
I've highlighted certain portions that I'd like to talk to you about so it could streamline the process. This technical report is from February 2022, correct?
Yes.
Ms. Jones, could you please go to the highlighted portion on page 2? No, actually the number page 2. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Typically, PW, or as it is known in your report as produced water. It's known as produced water in your report, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Typically, produced water is highly saline and could contain many different constituents, such as suspended particles, dissolved mineral salts, organic compounds, for example, volatile and semi-volatile organic compounds, VOCs and SVOCs, petroleum, hydrocarbons, organic acids, and oils, naturally occurring radioactive material, NORM, other inorganic constituents, for example, sulfide and ammonia, chemical additives, and their transformational byproducts during well treatment or from the interactions with formation water. Extensive treatment is required to remove these constituents for safe reuse of treated produced water, which can include settling, media, filtration, coagulation, chemical precipitation, adsorption, biological treatment, membrane desalination, thermal distillation, and advanced oxidation processes. Other than not reading the sites, did I read that correctly?
You did.
Then it continues. One of the barriers to using treated produced water as an alternative water source is the lack of comprehensive characterization of produced water quality. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And then if you go to the last highlight on that same page, the Permian Basin in southeastern New Mexico and western Texas is the most productive oil province in the U.S. and accounted for almost 60% of onshore oil production in July 2021. However, there are limited studies focused on the characterization.
So I'm sorry, would you, it's too loud?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to start from however. However, there are limited studies focused on the characterization of produced water in the Permian Basin, especially the produced water from unconventional wells. Is that correct?
Yes.
You and your co-authors wrote what I just read, correct?
Yes, I'm a co-author on this report, but I actually I didn't write this sentence, but I agree with that. Yeah.
But you did what?
I agree with the opinion, the factors.
Okay, so you agree with the opinion even though you didn't write those specific sentences.
Yes.
Could you please, Ms. Jones, scroll to page 3? The highlighted portion there reads, thus, comprehensive chemical characterization and risk assessment of produced water is necessary for potential treatment and beneficial use outside the oil and gas field in the Permian Basin. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, correct.
You would agree that the comprehensive characterization of Permian Basin produced water is scant, and what I just read is an accurate account of the state of science today, just as it was in 2022 when this technical report was completed, right?
Can you repeat your question?
You would agree that the comprehensive characterization of Permian Basin produced water is scant, meaning there's not a lot of it. And what you just read what I just read, sorry, is an accurate account of the state of science today, just as it was in 2022 when this technical report that you authored was completed. Ms. Jones, can we please go to page 12? I'm going to read that highlighted portion as well. Currently, there is very little data or other information regarding NORM, that's NORM capitalized, in Permian Basin produced water. 9 of the produced water temporal samples were analyzed for NORM, RA, which stands for radium, correct?
Correct.
RA 226 with a half-life of 1,500 years, and RA 228 with a half-life of 5.75 years were chosen because they are the most abundant. The results show that the RA, which is a combination of RA 226 and RA 228, has an average level of 109 D5 picocuries per liter, which is much higher than the EPA regulatory limit of 5 picocuries per liter for drinking water. Did I read that correctly?
Correct.
And then on the bottom of the page, turning to the next one, Ms. Jones, if you would. Thank you. Currently,
Ms. Nasi, what we've been able to see, even though Ms. Jones has been going to the pages you've identified, we haven't seen highlighting except the first time. So continue down to page 13, Pam. And let's see if there's highlighting here. No. So if you tell us what paragraph you're looking
okay,
at.
it's the first paragraph.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry about that. I don't know. Currently, there is limited data or information regarding the presence of NORM in Permian Basin produced water. Radium 226 and 228, uranium 234 and 238, thorium 228 and 230, polonium 210 and plutonium 238 were detected in the samples. In contrast, neptunium 237, americium 241, uranium 235, thorium 232, and plutonium 239 and 240 were not detected. RA 226 half-lives of 1,600 years and radium 228 half-lives of 5.75 years were chosen for comparison because they are the most abundant and most widely detected in other basins and represent the first soluble daughter product in the uranium 238 and thorium 232 decay chains, respectively. Results show total radium 226 and radium 228 has a mean level of 469.3 picocuries per liter. Is that correct?
Correct.
The concentrations of radioactive material is almost 100 times the water supply criterion in the state's standards for interstate and intrastate surface waters codified at 20.6.4 NMAC. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a statement in my testimony.
You are aware, are you not? Exposure to radium can cause a number of health problems, including cancer, especially bone cancer, liver cancer, and breast cancer, anemia, which is a decreased ability of the blood to transport oxygen, cataracts or growth in the eyes, broken teeth or cavities. Radium can reduce bone growth or necrosis of the jaw, and radium can be an immune system depressant. Are you aware that those are the effects if someone is to be exposed to radium?
I know over some concentration, I mean, when the concentration beyond the limit, it will pose a risk to human health.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ms. Jones, could you please scroll to page 17? Yes, thank you. In the first paragraph, in the copy that I gave you, and I apologize to the commission, I highlighted something that I'd like to read. Detected VOCs include benzene, minimum to maximum 1900 to 4900 micrograms per liter, toluene 1700 to 3700 micrograms per liter, ethyl benzene 72 to 160 micrograms per liter, and xylene 710 to 1600 micrograms per liter. That together is often referred to as BTEX, BTEX, of which benzene, toluene, and xylene had the highest relative abundances. Results are consistent with other studies and are anticipated because these compounds are closely related to oil and gas production. Dr. Q, did I read that correctly?
Correct.
Dr. Q, you would agree that exposure to VOC vapors can cause a variety of health effects, including eye, nose, and throat irritation, headaches, and loss of coordination, nausea, and damage to the liver, kidneys, or central nervous system.
Same answer as last question. When the concentration beyond the limit, I need to check the limit. It will pose a risk to human health.
And prolonged exposure to VOCs or repeated exposures to VOCs may contribute to even more serious health problems, especially with individuals who have lung disease. Is that also true?
I think so.
And Ms. Jones, this is the last reading from this report. Thank you. Ms. Jones, could you please turn to page 25? Thank you kindly. I'm going to be reading from the first paragraph, which is 3.6 under the title Acute and Chronic Toxicity. The high salinity of produced water was considered as a major mechanistic mode of toxicity for exposed organisms. In addition, other potentially harmful chemical species present in produced water, including organic petroleum-related hydrocarbon species, for example, PAHS, heavy metals, lead, arsenic, nickel, radionuclides, and industrial fracturing additives such as biocides, surfactants, surfactants, and polymers may also contribute to the whole toxicity of produced water. Thus, to properly assess risk, having an a priori understanding of the ecotoxicity effects of produced water to different organisms is necessary for both risk management and helping to define the most toxic components and necessary treatment strategies prior to produced water discharge and reuse. Did I read that correctly?
Correct.
Dr. Hugh, you note in your testimony that there are over 1,100 chemicals identified in produced water, correct?
Can you give me a reference? Which page? Which testimony?
I'm pretty sure it's your direct, and I'll get you that. Actually, my co-counsel is going to help me with that, so we're going to move on, and I'll come back to it when I have the exact page number. The one page number I don't write down, and you asked me about it. Okay, so now there is a version of this report that you wrote. It's a similar version that appeared as NMED Exhibit 140 that you cited in your testimony. Is that correct?
You mean what's the exhibit number?
If Ms. Jones, if you wouldn't mind, please bringing up the Journal of Hazardous Material. And the Bates stamp number is 3928.
Yes, I included this paper in my testimony.
And this is very similar to the characterization of produced water in the Permian Basin for potential beneficial use that we have been talking about.
Actually, there are two different products. So for this paper, it's a peer-reviewed paper. I mean, I included this peer-reviewed paper in my testimony. And the next one is the technical report. So, I'm on co-author of this technical report, but I'm not on co-author on this paper. That's my clarification.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. But you're familiar with this report because you cited it in your testimony, right?
For this paper, I cited it in my testimony, but I didn't cite this technical report in my testimony.
Right. So I just want to go back to that one question that I asked you before. And it is in your direct testimony, which is Exhibit 5, page 9, Bates stamp number 123. And the question I asked you was, you note in your testimony that there are over 1,100 chemicals identified in produced water. And the exact quote from your testimony is that there is a total of 1,198 chemicals have been identified in produced water. Is that correct?
The next number is from literature review paper. It's from a review paper.
It's
Yeah.
from a peer-reviewed paper, correct?
But that paper is a literature review paper. It's not a research paper.
It's a literature
Yeah.
review.
It doesn't mean there are 1,200 chemicals in one produced water sample.
Now going back to New Mexico Environment Department Exhibit 140, which is bait stamp 3928. Ms. Jones, can you move it down a little bit? And does this have under that like map there that's showing on the screen? Okay, that is the abstract. And I'd like to read to you two parts from that abstract. This study provides the first step to better understand produced water quality to develop beneficial reuse programs that are protective of human health and the environment. Do you see that second sentence of the abstract?
Yes,
Did I read that correctly?
correct.
Okay, somewhere in the middle there's another sentence that begins with PW samples, which stands for produced water samples, correct?
Correct.
Produced water samples had total dissolved solids, TDS, concentration ranging from 100,800 to 201,500 milligrams per liter. Did I read that correctly?
Correct.
Various mineral salts, metals, oil, and grease, volatile and semi-volatile organic compounds, radionuclides, ammonia, hydraulic fracturing additives, and per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. I'll spell that for the record. POLYFLUOR, excuse me, OALKYL. Substances were detected at different concentrations. Is that correct?
Yes. And the last word means PFAS.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
So that very long word that I couldn't say so well is often referred to as PFAS, capital P, capital F, capital A, capital S. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Could you please now go to the PFAS section of this report, which is on bait stamp number 3935. Ms. Jones, may I ask if you would go to that section in this report, which is section 3.4. Yes, and it is on bait stamp page 3935. So Dr. Hugh, when you did the characterization, when you wrote this characterization of produced water in the Permian Basin for potential beneficial use, was there a discussion of PFAS in this report?
Actually, I don't know, because for this technical report, I contributed to two parts. The 3.5, the microbial community analysis, 3.6, accurate and caloric toxicity. So for the chemical analysis, I didn't do any contribution from that. So
Okay.
I
But-
cannot recall.
But in this report that is peer reviewed, that relies on the same data, right?
I believe so.
This technical report, this peer reviewed report, scientific report, that appeared in the Journal of Hazardous Materials has a whole section about PFAS and the findings of PFAS in the produced water in the Permian Basin, correct?
Correct.
Actually, it's the only study right now that we know of that talks about produced water in the Permian Basin and findings of PFAS. Is that also correct?
I believe so, because I think I have this statement in my testimony.
So if we could now go to the very first paragraph. And I'd like to read the third sentence there. PFAS can accumulate or concentrate in the environment and may have the potential to cause adverse health effects. The US EPA established the lifetime health advisory levels of 70 nanograms per liter for combined, and I'm going to spell this, PER dash FLUOR OOCTANESULFONIC acid, which is referred to as PFOS, and I'm going to spell this again, PERFLUOROOCTANOIC acid, which is referred to as PFOA, concentrations in drinking water. So did I read that right?
Yes.
And if you go to the next column, in the middle, it says 5 PFAS compounds were detected in the produced water sample. And at the end of that column on the right, it says identification of these substances is challenging due to trade secret or proprietary information. Further non-target and target analytical methods can be utilized to characterize these substances in produced water. Did I read that correctly?
Correct.
Dr. Hugh, are you familiar with the fact that California requires that any produced water reuse requires the disclosure of all chemical additives, and that there is that if a producer doesn't disclose them, that is subject to penalty?
No.
Now, if you could go to the next page, Ms. Jones. The conclusion of this PFAS section says, importantly, more analyses of diverse samples are needed. Do you see that?
Yes.
I believe you said in your direct, understanding the amount of total dissolved solids in produced water is crucial for management of produced water, correct?
Yes.
And just like what we've been reading, you also said that some Permian Basin produced water has as much as 201,000 micrograms per liter.
What's your question?
That's what you testified to in your direct, is that right?
You mean the TDS concentration? Yes.
of all the things that I've read from this report, this scientific report that you included in your testimony, you agree with those conclusions, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I have one more report to go over with you. And Ms. Jones, would you please bring up analysis of regulatory framework for produced water management and reuse in major oil and gas producing regions in the United States? It's no, maybe I didn't send this to you. Analysis of regulatory framework. Okay. And this is in the record as New Energy Economy Exhibit 4, Norman Gaum, Exhibit 20. So all parties should have it. And this scientific report, have you ever seen this report?
It's a peer-reviewed paper.
Yes.
Yeah.
Have you seen this? before?
Yes. Yes. I have this in hand.
And Dr. Pei Xu, P-E-I-X-U, was one of the authors of this report, scientific peer-reviewed report.
Yes.
And she is the associate director of the consortium.
Yes.
And this was not included in the NMED's filing, 5,500 plus pages. This was not included, right?
I didn't include this paper in my testimony, but I'm not sure for other witnesses.
And this is entitled Analysis of Regulatory Framework for Produced Water Management and Reuse in Major Oil and Gas Producing Regions in the United States. And this was from July 2022. Correct?
Right.
On the first page, near the bottom, yeah, right there. It says, given the complexity surrounding produced water regulations and rules, this study is intended as preliminary guidance for produced water management and for identifying the knowledge gaps and research needs to reduce the potential impacts of treated produced water reuse on the environment and public health. Did I read that correctly?
Correct.
Now, if you could go to page 26 of this same paper, again, this is attached to New Energy Economy Exhibit 4, which is Norman Gaum's testimony, and it's his Exhibit 20. I'd like to read a couple of parts that are highlighted there, but not, I think maybe, let's see if they're highlighted here. It's on the right, top right-hand corner. It says 26 of 33. good. The treatment effectiveness for removing the chemical constituents in produced water needs to be demonstrated to protect the environment and public health during beneficial use. Because of varying levels of oil residues, salts, suspended solids, petroleum hydrocarbons, metals, norm, NORM capitalized, and other chemicals and potential toxins, produced water must be treated to meet the water quality requirements for fit for purpose uses. There are many produced water pre-treatment and treatment processes available that include modular and scalable components. However, current treatment technologies are often not cost competitive as compared to the options of SWD, well disposal, or water reuse, or HF. Did I read that correctly? SWD is saltwater disposal, right?
Yes,
And HF is hydraulic fracturing, correct?
correct.
And then if you go down further to that other highlighted portion, it says, as manufacturers are unwilling to reveal key details about the chemical additives due to trade secrets, it makes it difficult to identify these chemicals and assess their associated risks during reuse. For risks and toxicology assessment, it is imperative that the chemical additives be disclosed as well as the volume and frequency of their use. Did I read that correctly?
Yes,
And you would agree with that, right?
in my knowledge, I agree with that.
And then if you go to just the very next page, and yeah, I'll start with that first highlighted portion. Up to date, there are limited studies and no established tools to monitor these unknown transformation compounds and understand the toxicity effects of the chemical interactions during reuse applications. Did I read that correctly, Dr.
Correct.
Yu?
Correct.
If you go down to the last highlighted portion, the risks associated with reusing treated produced water still require intensive research. Given produced water is a new, non-traditional water source, and the water chemistry is complex with naturally occurring constituents and chemical additions during the well stimulation process. Water quality standards for different reuse applications should consider the known and unknown chemicals and toxicological characteristics of produced water and treated produced water. Intensive research is needed to provide scientific and technical knowledge to establish science-based regulations and develop well-informed permitting programs for the safe reuse of treated produced water outside of the oil and gas fields. Did I read that correctly?
Yes,
And do you agree with that statement, Dr. Hugh?
yes, I agree with this.
No further questions.
Fine, thank you very much, Ms. Nanasi. Ms. Fox, we still have a little bit of time together. Sorry, what?
Madam Hearing Officer, I did have a few last questions for Ms. Murphy.
Oh, for Ms. Murphy.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, Ms. Fox.
I apologize.
Okay.
Ms. Murphy, I'd like to discuss the difference between bench scale projects, pilot projects, and industrial projects. Okay?
Yes.
Bench scale projects are tightly controlled lab-based scientific studies. Is that right?
Bench scale project means a project or study conducted in a lab.
Okay. Pilot projects are field science that's on a bigger scale than can be done inside of a lab, correct?
Yes.
Bench scale projects and pilot projects are the basic scientific procedures for how you study produced water, correct?
Correct.
And generally, you use bench scale projects to characterize the produced water, figure out what's in it, test hypotheses about how you might remove those contaminants. Is that right?
In a lab.
And that includes attempts at treatment and confirmatory testing, documentation, publication, peer review, that sort of thing, correct?
It could be. It's a definition.
Okay. And then pilot projects are used to take those lab tested hypotheses and findings to see if they hold up at a more real world scale, correct?
A larger scale. Yes.
It's still a controlled environment, but it's bigger. Is that right?
Yes.
And in pilot projects, you can evaluate cost effectiveness and feasibility at that larger scale, right?
Yes.
Now, based on NMED's testimony, you would agree that we need to do more scientific research before exposing humans, animals, and the environment to produced water, right?
Yes.
However, despite this concern and not having fully characterized produced water and how it might be treated, NMED's proposed rule allows for the use of produced water in industrial projects, correct?
Yes.
Doesn't the potential use of produced water in industrial projects as allowed under the proposed rule cause concern for health, safety, and the environment?
An industrial project does not discharge.
But that wasn't my question, right? My question was whether the use of produced water in industrial projects causes concern for health, safety, and the environment.
I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in. Within the scope of the rule, we would argue no.
I'd like to go back to Ms. Murphy with this question. Ms. Murphy, you would agree that industrial projects are large scale, correct?
I agree that they probably are.
You would agree that there are potentially lots of workers working at industrial projects, correct?
It could be.
You would agree that those workers might be exposed to produced water during the operation of the industrial projects, correct?
It very well could be.
There are also potentially huge amounts of produced water used in industrial projects, correct?
I suspect that's true, but I don't necessarily know.
Are you not concerned that the workers working on these industrial projects could become sick if they are exposed to the produced water?
I'm sorry, no one testified to this, and this is outside the
Madam
scope of this
Hearing
rule.
Madam
Right.
Hearing Officer, I
Mr.
would
Dunn.
object to the witnesses posing legal objections.
All right, it's just the line's been crossed quite a bit during this cross exam. So, Mr. Dodd, not one of them testified to worker safety. I have to ask you to move on.
Ms. Murphy, has NMED considered that there could be a major failure at an industrial project that could result in enormous amounts of produced water being released into the environment?
I believe this is beyond my testimony.
And so nowhere in your testimony is it addressed that there's some risk of this?
No.
And so without having considered the risks posed by industrial projects to the environment and health and safety, how can we be ready for industrial projects to be authorized under this rule?
I think others may have more experience with industrial discharge projects, so they would know what cooling water and process and boiler feeds are.
Were there other members of the panel that testified as to the risks posed by industrial projects to health, safety, and the environment?
I'm going to try and answer your question so that we can move on with this. When we develop regulations for the protection of ground and surface waters, we do take into account the threats as it pertains to ground and surface waters to human health and the environment. This rule, we believe, as proposed, has taken those considerations into account.
Okay.
And it is reflected in all of our testimony.
And so, Ms. Fulham, can you please direct me to where in the testimony the risks associated with large-scale industrial projects is discussed?
I cannot cite anything at this point in time. If you can point to my testimony, I'd be glad to discuss it. We have discussed ad nauseum the threats that produced water and the lack of research on produced water has posed and why this rule would be prohibitive to prevent discharges of such water.
Would you be surprised to hear that I can't find a single place in your testimony where it discusses your testimony or the testimony of any of the members of the panel that discusses the risks posed to health, safety, and the environment by large-scale industrial projects?
That statement, as you specifically quoted, probably is not in our testimony.
Would you be surprised to learn that nowhere in NMED's testimony there is any discussion of potential risk of accidental discharges or releases from large-scale industrial projects?
I would disagree with that. There are provisions in the general section of this regulation for all reuse that all the requirements in 20.6.2. And I'd like to clarify for the record, it's 1203. I think I might have said 1201 earlier. Under section 1203, which requires reporting of spills and releases.
That was not my question, however. My question was, would you be surprised to learn that nowhere in the testimony of any of NMED's witnesses is the potential for accidental discharges and the risk thereof from large-scale industrial projects discussed?
No.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Dodd. That will complete our technical case today. We will resume with public comment at 9. Following public comment, we'll hear from Ms. Fox, any redirect by Mr. Knight, and then we will move directly to Mr. Hightower, who has agreed that he is available tomorrow. Then we'll go to Mr. DeSalen, and then we'll talk. Thank you.